Meghan Markle has just given a bizarre new interview in Australia, trying to justify that trip and also receive international acclaim for her new moves in the fashion arena. But for me, this was totally bizarre. Australian Women's Weekly is where she's given the interview. Now,
Meghan Markle's latest international interview was supposed to rebuild her image, relaunch her fashion credibility, and remind the world that the Duchess of Sussex still commands headlines wherever she goes. But within hours, critics were not calling it inspiring, authentic, or even strategic. They were calling it something far more damaging. A carefully staged media operation, packed with contradictions, polished talking points, and what one veteran royal insider has now described as pure approved propaganda.
I think the whole Australia visit was a bit of a poke at the king. I mean, you remember the king is this king of Australia, and William is the heir to the throne of Australia. So the whole thing, I think, was call me Meg. Well, sorry, Meghan Markle, Duchess, whatever. Meg is a very Aussie way of saying something. Same as Hazza and Meg. You'll always be a loved member of our family, but you're no longer a working royal. That's it, you're out. Don't trade on the name and don't try to monetize the name. That was the clear message from Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
He's such a pussy.
The moment this interview landed, something about it immediately felt different, and not in the way Meghan Markle's team almost certainly intended, because what was presented to audiences across Australia as an intimate, warm, and refreshingly personal conversation about fashion, travel, identity, and cultural connection began, on closer inspection.
And to me, Jobbo, this looks like a PR job, okay? It looks like this has been copy approved and the full works, but I'll take you through the whole thing,
without doubt,
okay?
Yeah.
So they write, Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, has long been a lover of fashion and a modern style icon. Really?
To look less like journalism and far more like a carefully managed image operation, one designed not to answer difficult questions, not to confront years of criticism, and certainly not to explain the growing concern surrounding the Sussex brand, but to quietly reframe a commercial strategy as something noble, artistic, and somehow rooted in public service. And for experienced royal watchers, media analysts, and even some former supporters of the Duchess, that was the first warning sign that this was never going to be a normal interview.
And to me, Jobbo, this looks like a PR job, okay? It looks like this has been copy approved and the full works, but I'll take you through the whole thing,
without doubt,
okay?
Yeah.
So they write, Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, has long been a lover of fashion and a modern style icon. Really?
Because of all the publications Meghan Markle could have chosen for what now appears to be her flagship Australian media re-entry, the platform selected was not a hard news publication, not a respected investigative magazine, not a major international fashion authority, and certainly not one of the elite editorial brands that would have challenged her on uncomfortable contradictions, financial motivations, or the increasingly blurred line between royal optics and personal monetization. Instead, the chosen platform was Australian Women's Weekly, a publication with a loyal audience, strong national recognition, and mainstream credibility, but not the kind of publication normally used when a global fashion figure genuinely wants to relaunch herself at the highest level. And almost immediately, veteran royal commentators began asking a deeply uncomfortable question.
Do you see where we're getting to? She's trying to justify selling her outfits, okay? To that end, Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, has partnered with One-Off to ensure the correct designers are credited. So it's nothing to do with her making money. Nothing to do with her making money at all. Of course not. One-Off is a global fashion marketplace. It allows participants like Meghan to share their looks and properly credit the designers. It also enables fans of the looks to purchase the items themselves. I mean, Jobbo, have you ever, firstly, seen more propaganda than that? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed for the Australian Women's Weekly publishing that.
Was this a strategic media comeback? Or was this simply the safest room available? That question became even harder to ignore when viewers began reading the language of the interview itself, because from the opening paragraphs, the editorial tone did not feel skeptical, investigative, or even traditionally journalistic. It felt admiring. It felt polished. It felt unusually cooperative. Meghan was described not as controversial, polarizing, or commercially ambitious, but as a long-standing style icon, a fashion visionary, and a woman whose influence continues to shape how millions dress around the world. And for critics who have spent years watching the Sussex media machine operate with remarkable discipline.
But also for her status, let's be honest, it's not It's not even UK Vogue. It's not even. It's not Tatler. This is women's. This is Australian women's week. It's just not where you do it. So it just shows you just how far she's come down. This is a woman what with her husband wants to monetize the royal family.
That language did not sound like independent reporting. It sounded like branding. It sounded like copy approval. And it sounded, as one veteran broadcaster bluntly put it, like a magazine handing over its credibility in exchange for access. But it was not the compliments that truly changed the direction of this story. It was one specific detail buried inside what initially looked like harmless fashion commentary, a detail so casually presented that many casual readers may have missed its significance entirely, yet for people who understand how celebrity commerce works, it changed everything. Because in her own words, Meghan confirmed that she has now partnered with a fashion marketplace platform designed to allow audiences not only to identify the outfit she wears, but to directly purchase those same looks through a structured commercial system. On the surface, the explanation sounded innocent enough. She claimed the goal was simple, making sure the correct designers received proper credit for their work. Fair enough. Reasonable. Even generous. But the operational reality, according to people who understand how influencer commerce actually functions, tells a very different story. Because fashion marketplaces do not exist simply to give designers polite acknowledgement. They exist to generate traffic. They exist to convert attention into purchases. And purchases, in the world of digital celebrity branding, often create commission streams, affiliate structures, licensing opportunities, and long-term revenue pipelines that can quietly transform public appearances into commercial assets. And suddenly, what looked like a conversation about supporting designers began to look like something much bigger, something much more deliberate, and for many critics, something far more troubling. Because this was not merely Meghan wearing fashion. This was Meghan monetizing visibility. This was Meghan turning the visual language of royal tours, the same kind of carefully curated public appearances once associated with duty, diplomacy, and institutional service, into something measurable, clickable, and potentially profitable. And that is where the criticism became personal, because the comparison many royal audiences made was immediate, unavoidable, and emotionally charged. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, steps onto an international tour, wears a local designer, and shines a global spotlight on smaller fashion houses, the designers benefit, the host nation benefits, and the monarchy strengthens cultural goodwill. There is no purchase link. There is no affiliate funnel. There is no commission structure quietly operating behind the scenes. The gesture remains institutional. The symbolism remains service. But when critics looked at Meghan's new interview, they saw something very different. They saw royal imagery, attached to modern influencer economics. And that, according to several veteran commentators now dissecting every word of this interview, may be the moment this stopped being a fashion story altogether, and became something far more dangerous for the Sussex brand. And once critics began looking beyond the polished photography, the carefully selected quotes, and the warm editorial language that framed Meghan Markle as both a global style influence and a woman effortlessly reconnecting with Australian audiences, the contradictions started appearing almost everywhere, not hidden in obscure footnotes, not buried in technical disclosures, but sitting openly inside the interview itself, woven into the very language that was supposed to humanize her, soften her image, and convince audiences that what they were watching was authenticity rather than strategy. Because the deeper people looked, the more this interview began to feel less like a candid conversation and more like a performance built around one very specific objective, making Meghan appear relatable in public while preserving every symbol of status where that status still carries commercial value. The first major signal came through what, on the surface, looked like an innocent and even charming moment, a playful phrase repeated throughout the Australian coverage in which Meghan encouraged people to call her Meg, a softer, more familiar, more approachable version of her name that instantly fit the easygoing Australian style of conversation and was clearly designed to create emotional closeness with the local audience. And at first glance, it worked. Casual readers saw warmth. They saw humility. They saw someone trying to step away from formality and connect with ordinary people. But for people who have followed the Sussex operation across both sides of the Atlantic, this single phrase triggered something else entirely. It triggered memory. Because the same Meghan who now smiles and tells Australians to call her Meg is the same Meghan whose staff, event organizers, and media handlers in the United States have repeatedly ensured that she is introduced with full institutional precision, Duchess of Sussex, with a title announced before speeches, before appearances, before private dinners, and before high-level networking events where that title opens doors, creates hierarchy, and instantly changes the social dynamic in the room. And suddenly, what looked like relatability began to look more like calibration. Informality where populism creates emotional goodwill. Formality where titles create influence. Warmth where audiences crave authenticity. Institutional branding where powerful people still respond to status. And for critics, that was not authenticity. That was segmentation. It was the kind of behavioral pattern media strategists understand immediately, because the most sophisticated public figures do not present one identity to every audience. They present the identity most useful for the room they are standing in. And as commentators began comparing Meghan's Australian, call me Meg positioning with the far more formal institutional branding that continues to surround her in American elite circles, the conclusion many viewers reached was deeply uncomfortable. They were not watching someone become more authentic. They were watching someone become more adaptive. And that perception only intensified when the interview moved deeper into fashion, because Meghan did not simply talk about wearing local designers, supporting smaller labels, or celebrating regional craftsmanship during her recent Australian appearances. She framed those choices almost as personal philosophy, as if every outfit represented thoughtful cultural diplomacy, a deeper emotional connection with the people she was visiting, and a genuine desire to elevate creators who might otherwise remain unseen. On paper, it sounded admirable. It sounded royal. It sounded remarkably close to the language traditionally associated with official tours conducted by senior members of the monarchy. But once audiences understood that those same outfits were now connected to a commercial marketplace capable of converting public admiration into measurable consumer transactions, the emotional meaning changed instantly. Because service and monetization may look identical in photographs, but operationally, they are not remotely the same. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, wears an emerging designer during an overseas visit, the value flows outward. The designer gains recognition. The host nation receives cultural visibility. The institution strengthens diplomatic goodwill. The spotlight becomes a form of service. But when a public figure creates a system in which audiences can immediately purchase the exact same look through a structured commercial platform, the direction of value changes. The attention no longer flows outward. It flows inward. Visibility becomes traffic. Traffic becomes sales. Sales become data. And data, in the modern creator economy, becomes long-term leverage. And suddenly, critics were no longer asking whether Meghan looked good on tour. They were asking whether the tour itself had become the product. That question became even harder to dismiss when people inside fashion media began quietly pointing out something else, something that may seem superficial at first but, in the world of celebrity positioning, carries enormous significance. If Meghan truly wanted to relaunch herself as a global fashion authority, why was this interview not appearing in elite editorial publications? Why not Vogue? Why not established luxury publications with international fashion influence? Why not platforms known for shaping industry narratives rather than simply reflecting celebrity culture? Why choose a mainstream lifestyle publication rather than a prestige launch platform capable of instantly re-establishing high fashion credibility? For some commentators, the answer was brutally simple. Because prestige publications ask difficult questions. Prestige publications demand numbers, partnerships, strategy, proof, and substance. Prestige publications do not simply repeat branding language and call it journalism. And if that interpretation is even partially accurate, then this interview may not have been designed to impress the fashion world at all. It may have been designed to bypass it completely, speak directly to emotionally receptive audiences, and create the appearance of momentum without exposing the mechanics behind it. And once that possibility entered the conversation, the interview itself began to look less like image repair, and more like something far more dangerous for the Sussex brand. Because when audiences start questioning not just what you say, but why you chose the room, why you chose the platform, and why nobody in that room asked the hard questions, credibility can disappear far faster than image can ever be rebuilt. And if the questions surrounding the publication itself were already beginning to damage the credibility of Meghan Markle's latest media push, what happened next may have done something even more dangerous. Because once viewers stopped focusing on the words printed on the page and started comparing those words with Meghan's own public history, the interview began to unravel in ways her team almost certainly did not anticipate. Because the problem was no longer whether the magazine had asked tough enough questions, whether the editorial language felt unusually cooperative, or whether the fashion partnership carried hidden commercial motives. The problem now was consistency. And in the age of digital memory, consistency can destroy a carefully managed narrative faster than any hostile headline ever could. One of the most revealing moments came when Meghan began speaking nostalgically about one of the outfits she wore during her Australian appearances, describing the look as a subtle tribute to her pre-royal acting years, specifically referencing the polished corporate style associated with Rachel Zane, the ambitious legal character she portrayed for years on the television drama Suits. On the surface, the comment sounded harmless, even clever, the kind of cultural callback designed to make longtime supporters smile and remind audiences that before royal titles, before global controversies, and before billion-dollar streaming deals, Meghan had built a recognizable identity in Hollywood on her own terms. But for people who have followed the Sussex brand from the very beginning, that single comment created a contradiction so obvious that it became impossible to ignore. Because for years, one of the central narratives surrounding Meghan's transformation was that she had moved beyond Hollywood, transcended celebrity culture, and entered a far more serious chapter of public life through her marriage to Prince Harry, a narrative built around service, global impact, humanitarian work, and institutional responsibility rather than auditions, red carpets, and commercial self-promotion. That was the story audiences were repeatedly encouraged to believe. Hollywood was the past. Royal purpose was the future. Glamour had evolved into service. Fame had evolved into meaning. But now, in one carefully managed fashion interview designed to strengthen her public image, Meghan was suddenly reaching back to that same acting identity, using Rachel Zane not as a forgotten chapter, but as an active branding asset. And for critics, that raised an uncomfortable question. If the Hollywood identity was supposedly left behind, why was it suddenly being pulled back into the spotlight the moment commercial fashion partnerships entered the conversation? Because in media strategy, nostalgia is rarely accidental. Nostalgia activates memory. Memory activates loyalty. Loyalty activates spending. And when audiences who once loved Meghan as a television actress are reminded of the polished, ambitious, stylish woman they first admired on screen, the emotional bridge between entertainment fandom and commercial purchasing becomes dramatically easier to build. Suddenly, the outfit is not just a shirt. It is Rachel Zane energy. It is confidence. It is ambition. It is identity. And identity, in modern influencer economics, sells better than almost anything. But that was only the beginning. Because as commentators continued dissecting the interview, another pattern began to emerge, one involving not just what Meghan said, but who kept appearing in her fashion references. Specific designers. Familiar labels. Repeated names. Brands linked to previous royal tours. Outfits tied to major life moments. And while casual readers may have seen sentimental storytelling, industry observers saw something else entirely. They saw a narrowing network. They saw a public figure who once had access to nearly every major fashion house in the world now repeatedly circling back to a smaller group of established relationships, trusted names, and commercially safe associations. And in celebrity branding, narrowing networks often tell a deeper story. They can signal loyalty. They can signal comfort. But they can also signal reduced access, shrinking industry enthusiasm, or a strategic retreat from elite circles where reputational risk has become harder to manage. And as this conversation began spreading through royal commentary channels, fashion insiders, and online communities, one uncomfortable theory started gaining momentum. What if this interview was not launching Meghan upward, but quietly managing expectations downward? Because the comparison many viewers made next was immediate, emotional, and almost inevitable. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, steps onto an international stage, the designers often change, the host nations change, the cultural references evolve, and the strategic symbolism expands with each appearance, creating the impression of institutional confidence, global reach, and constantly renewing influence. But in Meghan's case, critics argued they were beginning to see something different. Familiar references. Familiar stories. Familiar branding. Familiar emotional anchors. Less expansion. More repetition. Less discovery. More reinforcement. And once that perception begins taking hold, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to reverse, because audiences are no longer asking whether you are stylish, talented, or marketable. They begin asking a far more dangerous question. Are you growing, or are you recycling? And if that question was already uncomfortable for Meghan's team, what happened during one seemingly light-hearted Australian video appearance may have turned a carefully staged image campaign into something far harder to control, because for the first time during this tour, audiences were not reading words, not interpreting headlines, and not analyzing strategic language. They were simply watching raw human reaction unfold in real time. And what they believed they saw may have changed the entire direction of the story. And sometimes, in the middle of a carefully managed media campaign, it is not the interview, the headline, the polished photography, or even the strategically approved talking points that cause the most damage. Sometimes it is a single unscripted facial expression, a fraction of a second, a tiny reaction that most public figures would assume nobody noticed. Yet in the age of social media, slowed footage, reaction channels, and audiences who now study celebrity behavior frame by frame, those tiny moments can become more powerful than an entire public relations strategy. And according to many of the commentators now dissecting Meghan Markle's Australian media push, that may be exactly what happened next. Because while the magazine interview was still circulating, another piece of Australian content began spreading across commentary channels, reaction pages, royal discussion forums, and increasingly critical social media communities, a video segment designed, on paper, to humanize Meghan, soften the accusations of calculated branding, and remind audiences that beyond the fashion partnerships, the titles, and the endless commercial speculation, there was still a warm, approachable public figure, capable of connecting naturally with ordinary people. It should have worked. In many ways, it was the perfect follow-up. The setting was informal. The atmosphere was relaxed. The energy felt unscripted. And the people Meghan was meeting were immediately likable, young Australian creators whose warmth, sincerity, and genuine excitement created exactly the kind of emotional environment that usually works beautifully on camera. And for a few moments, it did. The smiles were there. The eye contact was there. The casual conversation appeared effortless. The optics, at least initially, were exactly what any experienced media advisor would want, because after an interview already being criticized for feeling polished, controlled, and suspiciously cooperative, this kind of organic human interaction had the potential to reset the entire conversation. Suddenly, the focus could move away from commission structures, magazine credibility, and commercial partnerships, and back toward personality. Back toward warmth. Back toward relatability. Back toward the version of Meghan her team has spent years trying to reintroduce to skeptical audiences. But then came the moment people cannot stop replaying. At one point during the interaction, Meghan was offered a glass of Australian beer by her hosts, a simple cultural gesture, warm, friendly, spontaneous, and exactly the kind of harmless social exchange that usually creates charming clips, light-hearted headlines, and easy audience goodwill. There was no confrontation, no political tension, no hostile questioning, no difficult media pressure, just hospitality, just ordinary people sharing something local with a global public figure. And yet, according to viewers now analyzing the footage frame by frame, Meghan's reaction lasted less than 2 seconds, and may have undone hours of carefully managed image repair. Because the moment the drink touched her lips, something changed. It was subtle, almost invisible if you were not paying attention. A tightening around the mouth, a shift in the eyes, a brief hesitation, a facial response that many viewers immediately interpreted as discomfort, surprise, or in some cases, visible disgust. And once that clip reached social media, everything changed. Because audiences no longer needed analysts. They no longer needed journalists. They no longer needed magazine editors or royal commentators to tell them what to think. They believed they had seen it for themselves. And in modern media, perceived authenticity, whether positive or negative, often carries more weight than any carefully prepared statement. Within hours, reaction channels began slowing the footage down. Commentators began replaying the exact moment. Body language experts started weighing in. Social media users began asking whether the smile had slipped, whether the actress had briefly dropped character, whether the polished public image that had survived years of criticism had, for one unguarded second, revealed something audiences were never meant to see. And suddenly, what was supposed to be a humanizing moment became something far more damaging, because it fed directly into one of the oldest criticisms Meghan's detractors have repeated for years, that the warmth is real, until the camera catches what happens between the performances. Now, fair or unfair, that perception matters, because public figures do not live inside facts alone. They live inside interpretation. They live inside emotional memory. They live inside repeated clips, memes, reaction videos, and audience impressions that often become stronger than the original event itself. And once viewers believe they have caught an unscripted moment, once they believe they have seen the mask slip, rational explanations become almost irrelevant. And that may be exactly why veteran commentators immediately connected this moment to something much bigger, something beyond beer, beyond body language, and far beyond one awkward clip. Because for years, Meghan's public identity has been built on performance, not necessarily deception, but performance in the broader sense: polished messaging, carefully calibrated vulnerability, emotional timing, strategic interviews, and the ability to move effortlessly between Hollywood storytelling and royal symbolism. That is not unusual in public life. In fact, it is often necessary. But the danger comes when audiences stop admiring the performance and start looking for the performance itself. And according to people now watching this Australian rollout unravel in real time, that shift may already be happening. Because once viewers begin asking whether the smile is genuine, whether the humility is strategic, whether "Call Me Meg" is connection or calibration, and whether a humanizing video is actually just another carefully managed brand extension, the conversation stops being about fashion, publicity, or interviews altogether. It becomes something far more difficult to control. It becomes a question of trust. And if trust is beginning to crack around Meghan Markle's latest international image campaign, what happened next may be even more dangerous, because the attention was no longer focused on Meghan alone. For the first time in this story, the spotlight began turning back toward Prince Harry, and what audiences were now saying about him may be even harder for the Sussex brand to recover from. And once the attention shifted away from Meghan Markle's carefully managed Australian interview, away from the fashion partnerships, the "Call Me Meg" branding, the commission questions, the body language clips, and the growing accusations of copy-approved journalism, something even more uncomfortable began happening for the Sussex brand. Because audiences who had spent the first half of this story questioning Meghan's credibility suddenly started asking a far more damaging question. If this entire media rollout feels calculated, polished, and commercially engineered, where exactly does Prince Harry fit into all of it now? Because for years, Harry was positioned as the emotional heart of the Sussex story, the wounded prince, the son of Diana, Princess of Wales, the man who walked away from palace life claiming he wanted freedom, privacy, healing, and a chance to protect his wife and children from the same pressures that shaped his childhood. And in the beginning, millions believed him. They saw vulnerability. They saw trauma. They saw a man breaking away from an institution he believed had failed his mother and was now failing his own family. But 6 years later, after documentaries, interviews, speaking tours, podcast deals, memoir launches, and increasingly aggressive commercial branding, a very different conversation is now taking shape across royal commentary circles, independent journalists, and even mainstream American media. More and more people are beginning to ask whether Harry left the system, or simply exchanged one system for another. And that question became even sharper this week when old footage of Prince Harry speaking at international events began circulating again, particularly clips in which he presents himself as a global commentator on democracy, public health, climate change, misinformation, constitutional rights, and the future of Western institutions, speaking with the authority of someone positioned not merely as a former royal, but as a serious international voice. On paper, that should strengthen his image. On paper, it should remind audiences that he still carries influence far beyond palace walls. But according to veteran royal commentators now dissecting those appearances, something very different is happening. Because audiences are no longer simply listening to Harry's words. They are comparing his words to his choices. They are comparing speeches about truth with media campaigns now accused of narrative manipulation. They are comparing lectures about service with a brand increasingly linked to monetization. They are comparing warnings about disinformation with magazine interviews critics now describe as polished public relations exercises. And once those comparisons begin, the damage becomes deeply personal, because Harry's credibility was never built on business strategy, Hollywood access, or celebrity networking. Harry's credibility was built on emotional authenticity. And emotional authenticity, once questioned, is one of the hardest things in public life to recover. That is why some of the strongest reactions this week did not come from palace insiders, hostile tabloids, or anonymous online critics. They came from commentators who once defended Harry, who once argued that the younger son of King Charles III had every right to step away, protect his family, and build a new life on his own terms. Because even among former supporters, a painful realization appears to be setting in. Freedom was supposed to mean independence. Freedom was supposed to mean privacy. Freedom was supposed to mean building a life where titles, hierarchy, and institutional pressure no longer controlled the narrative. But what critics now believe they are watching looks very different. They see a man who said he wanted out, while still using royal symbolism. They see a man who rejected institutional duty, while continuing to speak with institutional authority. They see a man who walked away from palace rules, while remaining financially connected to the very public identity those rules helped create. And perhaps most painfully of all, they see a man who once accused others of controlling the narrative, now standing beside a media machine increasingly accused of doing exactly the same thing. Inside royal circles, that creates a very different kind of concern, because while Meghan may continue generating controversy, criticism, and endless debate, Harry still represents something far more emotionally significant to millions of people in Britain, the Commonwealth, and across the world. He is still the younger brother of Prince William. He is still the son of King Charles. He is still part of the legacy of Diana. And every time his image becomes tied to another controversy, another commercial rollout, another carefully timed media event, the emotional cost to the institution grows heavier. But according to people watching this story unfold from both sides of the Atlantic, the greatest danger may not be public criticism at all. The greatest danger may be audience fatigue. Because outrage creates clicks. Controversy creates headlines. Contradictions create viral clips. But over time, something even more dangerous can happen. Audiences stop getting angry and start switching off. And when viewers no longer believe the vulnerability, no longer trust the interviews, no longer feel emotionally connected to the story being sold, even the most carefully managed brand can begin losing the one thing no amount of publicity can buy back: belief. And that may be the real story emerging from Meghan Markle's latest interview. Not the fashion, not the titles, not the polished magazine coverage, and not even the accusations of propaganda, but a much bigger question now quietly spreading through royal circles, Hollywood networks, and millions of viewers who once believed every word. Are Harry and Meghan still shaping the narrative, or is the audience finally seeing the strategy behind it? What do you think? Was Meghan's latest interview genuine image rebuilding, or a carefully approved public relations operation from beginning to end? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoy deep royal analysis, insider stories, and the hidden power struggles shaping the future of the monarchy, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us, because this story is far from over.